Hi folks, so today we will go through a real backend live coding JavaScript interview that is aimed at testing your refactoring skills. For the record, Bogdan got this task in a live coding interview and passed it, and today he will share with us the exact steps he followed to pass this interview. As he solves the assignment, Bogdan will focus on how to apply clean code and solid principles to solve it, and also review a few core API design, Node.js, and JavaScript fundamentals on the way. Bogdan, are you ready?
Yes.
Awesome, then let's get it going.
Perfect. So, yes, this is exactly what I was presented with. It was a senior full stack, but with a very backend heavy kind of position with Node.js. And they sent me this over a couple of days before. And this was basically the instructions. Explore the code and tell us what is good or bad. The first thing I did is to take a top level view of everything in here. And I realized it's written with Nest.js. And a lot of the code is pretty standard.
Have you used Next.js in the past?
No, not before this interview, no.
And what would you tell developers that many times they face the same situation? They are being confronted with a technical assignment like this one that is written in a library they haven't used before. What was your first reaction? How do you deal with that?
So the first thing is this framework implements MVC. So we see here controllers and modules and services. And if we go into these folders, we see that say controllers, there's DTO, data transaction objects, entities. And so, yes, maybe you never used this before, but ideally, especially when you go for a senior full stack or backend position, you do know what MVC is, you know what the service is, you know the idea behind it. So it doesn't matter which kind of flavor they present you with, you should be able to more or less transfer your knowledge there. Or at least that's what you're expected to do. Now, looking at this code, most of the code smells were in this controller. And I identified that before the interview. And in the interview, I spent around 45 minutes refactoring this.
Just for the people watching us that are not familiar with the term of code smell, how do you quickly define it?
So basically, code smell, it's something you could define as a bad practice or something that can be improved. And it's pretty much based on certain best practices that I will present. So modifying global state can be considered a code smell in a JavaScript framework that implements immutability because it goes against the framework principle.
So the first thing you did was to kind of look at the structure of the application, understand this is MVC, and you kind of realize that the transaction controller was the one where most of your activity will be focused on, most of the code smells were.
Yes.
Awesome.
So basically, I started here in the interview. We couldn't really execute the code or run it. That was not the purpose. It was just looking at the code, discussing it, and applying changes. The first change that you can see here, because this is a controller, we see that it's a controller over, there's a decorator here. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what the framework does under the hood, but we see this is a path transaction, and it's a post method. So the first code method we see here is we have a post method on the path transactions. So applying REST principles, and add it here, what this method should return, it's not a promise that resolves to a string, it should resolve to a transaction object. Because in REST, the post method always returns the created object.
You need to return an entity, right? And that's the created object in the case of post, right?
Yes, and this is the first thing. You want to know REST principles, you want to know how REST endpoint looks like, what would be non-RESTful, and how to be able to correct this kind of code smells. The second thing would be naming. Functions should have ideally action names because functions are actions, and they should be explicit, which removes the name, it makes everybody understand what this function does. And commission is definitely not a good name for something that's supposed to create a transaction. So the first thing I did is to rename this to create transaction. And the second thing is I added here transaction object. And this makes this post method suffice or satisfy our REST implementation. And then I went on to understand what's happening here and try to refactor this, applying, we'll see in a second, the derive principle and pretty much the single responsibility from solid.
Yes.
So if you look at this code, you see we have this JSON stringify method, and it stringifies a certain object. But stringification is usually done at framework level when we send over the request. So this is a responsibility of the view or the framework normally. We do not need to do this in most standard backend frameworks. So you could even remove this. It's enough for us to return an object. It will get serialized into text when it gets sent over the network by the framework.
Understood. So that functionality was redundant already.
Exactly. The next thing is we see this parse float into fixed. This is kind of formatting logic, and it's repeated. So that's the easiest way to extract, right? We could actually extract that really quickly. We could call this format. This is amount, and I'll just extract the logic. This is an arrow function, receives amount and returns parse float of amount to fixed. By the way, they won't allow you to use Copilot for any of this, so better be good.
You mentioned you weren't able to run this code on your local machine, which means that you basically have to leverage on your knowledge. You cannot really check if things are actually working out, except leaving aside your linter. You have to be good at actually writing code and making sure it works without you having to go to the, let's say, compilation step. Right?
Yes, and you need to communicate your intentions, because it's not, maybe the code doesn't compile or run, but if you have a solid reason behind it, then they get, you know, what's your engineering mindset. They do get what's your intentions. Okay, so as we see, this is now pretty much straightforward, but so this doesn't really create a transaction object yet. And then there's these two functions, get amount with exchange and without exchange, that we are running depending on the currency. So this kind of logic, it's very hard to read, and that's why you always want to move this out into an if statement. Of course, there's better ways to do that, but in an interview with a brute force approach is the best. So you just take it out and simplify this. And then the next thing is these two functions, what do they really do? So that's when I start digging into the rest of the code. Yes, and then I went over get amount with exchange, and we see right now it's applying some rules to get a commission amount, and then it makes this call to this external service and subscribes to it. And whenever that service finishes whatever they need to do, they will basically call our callback, which inserts a transaction and then returns the commission amount, which
clearly introduces some side effects that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, the first problem is this is a get, it's getting an amount, and we are creating a transaction. So that's a side effect that already shouldn't be here, because if we apply the single responsibility principle, you really want to have one function for creating a transaction and then any other function to get the amount, and then use these two separately. The problem with modifying state in the database, modifying the database when you make a get, it might be completely misleading. So far, so good. And then the next thing is, okay, what about this one? What about the amount without exchange? And we see the same thing. We calculated the commission amount, and then we insert the transaction just like before. The only difference is there's no call to that external service. And so we see these two functions are actually very much overlapping. So the easiest thing is to, and I always recommend this, do the easiest thing first, which would be just have a function that computes the commission amount, and then use it in those two methods. Then have another function that creates the transaction and use it in these two methods. And then we actually see what is the difference between these two.
So basically, do not repeat yourself, right? Kind of abstract functionality that's being used in different places into one function that performs that action.
Exactly. That would be a combination between dry and the solid principle of single responsibility. So we added these two methods. I say it's asynchronous, and I'm just going to get ahead, take this code out just like that. Give me a sec. Put it here and see what do you need. I need a transaction input here. Copy that. So far so good. And I'm going to just return that commission amount. And then here we say constant commission amount. Let's go to this dot get the commission amount of the transaction. And we do the same in the function above. So we already removed repeated code. That's number one. And then we apply the same thinking to creating this transaction. So same thinking, we separate repeated logic into a specific parameter, into a specific method. We call this create persist transactions because we already had a create function at the top. So I call this persist. Yes. And this is going to be a bit nasty. I'm just going to take this, put it here, and just constant new transaction. It's equal to this. We're going to return the transaction. So we persist it into the DB, and then here we're just going to need this apparently transaction input that is of type transaction input. Let's see if that works. You will have to solve type errors very quickly. And we see here, we also need a commission amount. 1 second, I make this no wait. So we have an async method, and we don't need a function because it's a method on a class that returns, again, it returns a promise that resolves to a transaction. That would be the standard. And now, again, you see the types are not fully passing. I'll take care of that later. Now we could actually do this. We could constant new transaction. It's equal to this. I'm going to have to await this dot create persist transaction of the transaction input and the commission amount. And see, this commission amount is needed. So I'm gonna pass it here. And I think commission amount is of type whatever this returns. What is this? Any? Okay, I'll do any, but it never use any without explaining why. You never want to use any.
Because you're breaking the whole point of a typing system, of static typing
exactly.
as a whole.
Yes, and they wouldn't like that. So I'll just tell them here, if I go fast, because it's an interview, I need to be fast. I cannot be so explicit as I am now. I'll just tell them, we're going to leave any here for now, but I'll never use any in a production code base. And then maybe they ask you, why wouldn't you? And then you need to tell them that you're breaking type safety and so on, and use a generic type maybe instead of that. And you see, this is a lot easier now. We have get amount with exchange.
It's beautiful.
And the next thing is, okay, let's do the same to the other function. You remember we had this one. And so here we see, okay, that's done. And now this one creates a transaction, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just do constant new transaction. It's equal to await of this dot persist the transaction, and pretty much the same. We had the transaction input and we had the commission amount. Perfect. So I did that change and now we have this. The problem here is, you see I have this return in this callback. This will actually return in a vacuum because we are passing this as a callback to the subscribe method. At some point, this exchange rate service would finish whatever they need to do and then call that in the vacuum. There's no return here. So this function doesn't really return a transaction like this one did. And that's a big problem. And so this is one of the most complex part, and this is where they'll test your Node.js knowledge. You need to be able to refactor this into something that works with async await. And for that, we will need to use promises, okay?
You want to give it a shot?
Okay, so let's give it a shot then. We see we subscribe and what we want. I'm just going to write pseudocode, and I did exactly this in the interview. What we want is to actually be able to return a promise. And we want to resolve that promise with a transaction when it is done. And then, it all depends. And of course, we want to reject that if there's an error. Reject the promise if there is an error. And it helps if you've ever done this exercise before. I highly recommend it to all of you. Be able to create promises. Don't even think about interviewing for a senior position in the JavaScript ecosystem if you don't know how to do this. Ideally, do it fast under the pressure of an interview. We create a new promise. We take all our nasty code. I'll take it here. We won't need this anymore because the promise will reject by itself. And we're not going to return commission amount. And basically, we put the code we had. And whenever this transaction, it's done, right? That external service finished, they call our code. We resolve our promise with our new transaction that we created. And if not, we just reject it with the error. So I dumped this really fast. Ideally, you get to a point where you can do it as fast as I did it. Really important. Know how to use promises to transform subscription-based, event-based things into async await that we can use in normal control flow.
And by the way, for the people watching us, if you want Bogdan and I to make a more in-depth video about the promise constructor or any aspects of what he mentioned, then just let us know in the comments section and we will add it to our list.
Awesome. And if you got this far, this is pretty much done because now, there's some errors. This exchange rate was actually used to compute a different amount and pass it here. But if they see this is what they actually wanted us to do, if they saw this, you probably already passed the interview. Figuring out the details, you can always iron them out. And now going back to our code, right, to our starting point, we do know these functions. They get the commission amount, and then if this is not true, then we call the external service. And after that, we create a transaction and then we return it. And now we can use the methods we defined to actually just do all these steps. So I could do constant commission amount to go to this dot get the commission amount. I think I called it get commission amount. Give me a sec. We pass in the transaction input. So that's number one. And then we have this if statement. So you could create with the let I think this was the exchange rate or so, put it here to 1. And then we call that external service, get the exchange rate, and then create a transaction. So this would be constant new transaction equal to await of this dot create a persist transaction of, I think it was transaction input and commission amount. But again, this doesn't have to compile. So if you have some things that don't compile, unless it's something critical, they don't see anything, and we
Is
return
it
that.
commission or commission amount that you want in line 35?
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to rename this commission amount. We passed it in there. And the only thing that we didn't do here is to make this a method to get the actual exchange rate if the transaction currency is not euro, then, then the exchange rate response should be await await this dot. And this is where you need to simplify this method even more that we had here. See, we had this method that just gets an exchange rate, and rather than creating a transaction here to make this even cleaner, we just return the exchange rate. So I'm gonna put the exchange rate in. That's the only thing we do. We do not need to get the commission amount anymore. Okay, and this is just get exchange rate. Okay, and now going back to our logic, we just call that this dot get the exchange rate, and we pass in the transaction. And then you can even pass this, I don't like this if statements outside, to this method and say, hey, you know what? Give me the transaction input. If the currency is in euro, return 1. If it's not euro, get the exchange rate. If it's euro, just return 1. So to simplify this even more and really have that logic of getting the exchange rate in one single place, we could say if this, then just return 1. Because hey, if you have euro, if the transaction is euro to euro, then there's no need to transfer anything. I go back up here. I did that relatively fast, but because I did that change, I can now do this. Constant equals, and that's
and you also have that business logic that belongs to the exchange rate domain. It's not scattered around the code base. It's actually within that method.
Yes, exactly. And if you want it to be even cleaner, you would move this if, let me scroll back, to the actual service, because they should handle it. We just give them our currency, and we shouldn't have this if statement here because it's really logic that was, that it's abstractions that belongs to the
exchange rate service or domain or whatever, not.
Yeah. So we could say that the exchange service leaked some of its abstractions into this service. That's it. If you were getting this far, and this is where I got with them, they were more than happy to make a very generous offer. I think they offered around 10 to 20 on top of what their budget was, because the review from the interviewer was very good. I was interviewed by an engineer that had around 12 years of experience in the backend. It was a financial institution, pretty well-known startup in Europe.
So just one thing for the people watching us, you definitely have a lot of experience, not only being a software engineer yourself, but training software engineers back then, and you're quite fast, and you do have a very solid understanding of the backend, right? But what would you tell people when, because there's a few things here, right? The number one, you are in the red zone. The red zone being you are interviewed, and you are interviewed on code that you haven't written. So forget everything you know, right? Just number one, go back to the fundamentals, right? That's what I've seen. You talk about the promise constructor, you talk about the solid principles applied to the code. So what would what are the things that the developers, software engineers watching us should do for them to increase their chances of passing or to prepare for such an interview?
So to review, you want to know very well REST principles, apply the REST principles, not only like what's a REST API, but actually like, is this RESTful, is this not? You want to know solid in practice. There's not so many examples of this in real code basis, and especially on the JavaScript ecosystem, but ideally you know how to more or less look at some code and apply some of the solid without getting too purist in it. And you definitely want to know like JS fundamentals like async, right? Async/await and promise. You want to know these things because with the pressure of the interview, you'll most likely get nervous, forget things. And if you have this best practices very solidified in your brain, you can always fall back to those. No matter how nervous you are, you can always fall back to those. Yeah? And then train a bit of speed. You want to be fast in the interview. But if you mention all those, if you really touch on all those and show them how you can apply them, very important, then you will definitely stand out. But every decision you make on this code base should come from you reaching out to a best practice that you know.
Thank you, Bogdan. One last thing I would say for the people watching us, if you're interviewing right now and you're looking for a reliable way to find out what are your technical gaps, what are the things you could do to improve your interview performance, then check out the free technical assessment, which will help you find out exactly where you're at and what are the steps you should take for you to perform at a higher level, not only in technical interviews, but overall as a software engineer. Once again, thank you so much, Bogdan, and we will see you folks in the next one.